Let's take a look now at renewable energy sources. Remember, these can be continually renewed or sustained, which makes them more or less unlimited. Also remember, there is kind of an overlap between renewable and non-renewable resources. Do you know what that is? It's fifth grade. Reduce, reuse, and recycle. In some cases, think, I don't know, gold jewelry, for example. If you continually reuse it and recycle it, it becomes indefinitely usable. So you don't ever run out of it. These actions can stretch the lifespan of non-renewable finite resources. That is, reduce, reuse, recycle. To remind you, this is U.S. energy sources beginning with the revolution and going not to now, but near now. Remember, wood biofuels were originally what we used to heat and get energy from, cook, all of that. Then in the middle of the 1800s, we begin to use coal more as the Industrial Revolution progresses. Then towards the late 1800s, we switch over towards petroleum. Obviously, with the advent of the automobile and motorized vehicles, increasingly petroleum. Natural gas begins to be used a lot. And then, of course, in the 1950s, nuclear power begins to be used significantly more as we begin to understand nuclear power. And of course, hydroelectric is kind of running along there from the late 1800s as well. Once again, remember, about 80% of U.S. energy consumption is coming from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Globally, this is about 84%. It's not a lot of difference. Notice also that with renewables in the United States, this is 2019. I'm going to show you something in a minute that shows it a little bit less in terms of renewables, but it's a little bit older information. Nevertheless, right around 10% or so. And then nuclear power is about 8.5%, right around that. So we're talking about 20% is not fossil fuels. Of the renewables, let's see what we've got. This is saying 9%. Remember, this is 2011, so it's a little bit older, but as I said, think of it around 10%. What do we have? Solar, geothermal, that means it's heated by basically volcanic energy. You have hot magma inside the earth, and that heats water, which then is turned into steam and turns turbines. Waste, sometimes even from landfills, you can derive methane gas and then burn the methane gas, which then in turn will be able to drive turbines. Wind, of course, biofuels, wood, hydroelectric power. There you go. So the single largest of the renewable resources is hydroelectric power. In other words, running water through the bottom of a dam and then spinning turbines to make electricity. So we've got hydroelectric power, biomass or biofuels, wind, geothermal power, solar. It's not a lot. It's increasing slowly. It's the solar panels, it's getting them really to a point where they're very, very usable and very efficient. It'll come over time. I promise you it will come. What about nuclear power? Well, obviously uranium is a limited resource. It's a finite resource, but a very small amount of uranium produces a vast amount of energy when you run it through the process of upgrading it. Let's take a look at this. So nuclear countries ranked by 2015 production. Notice the United States is number 1, France is number 2, then Russia, China, and so on. You can see Japan over here. Japan was really important with regard to nuclear power, but because of the disaster with the tsunami and knocking out Fukushima Daiichi, they decided that they would begin to scale back on nuclear power. Now, I will tell you that what happened in Japan happened to a nuclear reactor and a nuclear power plant that was built in the 60s. What happened in Chernobyl in Ukraine was also 1960s technology. What happened at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania was also 1960s technology. The technology is better. I'm not trying to sell you on nuclear power, but the technology today is better. It not only extracts more energy out of smaller amounts of enriched things like uranium, but in addition to that, it's safer. I'm not saying it's perfectly safe, okay, but I'm saying it's safer than it used to be. Just like a 1960s automobile is not as safe as an automobile built in the 2020s, okay? They're just not. 1960s automobiles didn't have headrests, which are, of course, designed to keep your neck from breaking. They didn't have airbags. The seatbelts worked in a different way. So the car was not nearly as safe as a car is now. Now, nuclear power in terms of percentage of electricity. Well, look who's number one. France is number one. We are over in this area down here. Right? I'm going to tell you something about France. The reason France is number one is because of this. During the 1970s, there was an energy crisis, so-called. What happened essentially was this. The OPEC countries tried to punish Western countries primarily who supported Israel because Israel beaten the Arab countries in multiple wars. And as a result of that, to punish these countries who were supporting the state of Israel, they cut down production on oil. And what that did was it decreased oil and gasoline in westernized countries, the United States included, and it drove the prices up. I remember I had to push my mom's car multiple times up to get gasoline, and we had the car turned off. We were in a mile-long line, slowly going towards the gas pumps to be able to fill up. At that time, it was rotated based on your license plate number. So odd numbers went one day, even numbers went another day. Jimmy Carter, who was the president of the United States from 1976 to 1980, saw this and said that what we needed to do was get off of fossil fuels, especially oil imported from other countries. Not so much because of the pollution aspect, but because he just saw the people who produced it as not being good people in countries that did not have the West in general and the United States' best interests in mind. Here we are, 80% is still being produced by fossil fuels. So we didn't really heed that warning. Although I think, in my opinion, it was probably the correct thing to do. Now look at this. Operational nuclear power plants. Well, we lead the world in it, but remember, we have a bigger population than France, and we use a lot of electricity in the United States. And you can see with Japan, figure includes reactors which are offline, but potentially operational, because the Japanese have scaled back on their nuclear power as a result of what happened in 2011 because of the tsunami. Now, this is electricity generated from low carbon sources. Nuclear power is a low carbon source. It doesn't produce greenhouse gases. At the same time, things can go wrong. But notice, of course, the United States is actually doing pretty well with this. We are one of the world's leaders in low carbon sources for electricity. So in that way, not too bad.